Good afternoon. We are starting our afternoon session on press freedom in Turkey, and we will start with the presentation of his report by Philippe Leruth. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Madame the President, members of this tribunal, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving the opportunity to speak here. And as a preamble, I would like to say first, because it's a critic I received several times in the past, that my work to draft this report and my presentation are certainly not anti-Turkish. I consider Turkish is a very important country which deserves a true democratic regime, and I have the greatest admiration for the many Turks, and particularly the many Turkish journalists who are fighting tirelessly for their rights. And second, I would like to briefly introduce myself to you, not to show off, but to explain why I was asked to draft this report and why I was so busy with press freedom in Turkey for many years. My name is Philippe Leruth. I was for more than 4 decades a journalist in Belgium, and at the same time, I was for more than a quarter of a century busy with the defense of rights of journalists at Belgian level first. I was for 10 years president of the Belgian journalists. Then at a European level, I was for 9 years vice president of the European Federation of Journalists. And at last, I was for 3 years president of the International Federation of Journalists. The European and International Federation of Journalists are federations of journalist unions and associations, and 4 Turkish journalist unions belong to both. The TGS, Türkiye Gazeteciler Sendikası, the TGC, Türkiye Gazeteciler Cemiyeti, the GCD, Gazeteciler Cemiyeti Derneği, and Disk Bazin is Sendikası. In this context, I was confronted very early on with the problem of violation of press freedom in Turkey. As soon as in July 2001, as president of the Association of Professional Journalists in Belgium, I was contacted by a young Belgian woman of Turkish origin about the situation of a professional Turkish journalist, by that time her brother-in-law. Zeynel Abidin Kızılalçıprak was sentenced in first instance and on appeal to 16 months in prison and a huge fine of 1.6 billion Turkish pounds for separatist propaganda. His crime was that as the head of a publishing house, he had published a booklet containing the memoirs of a young Turkish soldier serving in 1986 in the Kurdish part of Turkey. I then contacted the Belgian Foreign Minister, Mr. Louis Michel, who happens to be the father of Charles Michel, the present president of the European Council, and I asked him to send a protest to his Turkish counterpart, whom he was due to meet in the following weeks. And Mr. Michel confirmed me later on that he had expressed the concerns of the Belgian authorities about Mr. Kızılalçıprak's fate and press freedom in Turkey. Mr. Kızılalçıprak was never imprisoned. He first went in exile in Germany, and after several years he returned to Turkey, where he was not imprisoned. His case, nevertheless, reached the European Court of Human Rights, which on October 2003 ruled in his favor and condemned Turkey for violating Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. As this case shows us, press freedom has been regularly violated in Turkey since the creation of the modern republic, and especially during the periods of military dictatorship, this freedom was particularly restricted. Some sensitive topics as the Armenian and Kurdish questions have always been very delicate to handle for journalists in Turkey. But now the time has come to wonder whether the lack of respect for press freedom has become a fundamental marker of Turkey's legal and political landscape or not, and whether the state of press freedom has deteriorated since Mr. Recep Tayyip Erdogan took office, first as Prime Minister in 2003, then as President in 2014, and particularly after the attempt coup on 15 July 2016. And to analyze this situation, two questions were asked. The first one, can Turkey currently be considered a country within which a sufficient degree of press freedom and freedom of expression is guaranteed so it can follow the standards of a functioning democracy? The second one, can the decisions taken by the Turkish government still be considered as a reaction to the attempt coup, or do they need to be evaluated as a way to destroy the voices and or organizations critical of the government? Turkey has international and national legal obligations to fulfill. Like many other countries, it signed and accepted the Human Rights Declaration of the United Nations on 6 April 1949. Freedom of expression is among the rights proclaimed in this declaration. Turkey further signed and affirmed the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, as well as the European Convention of Human Rights. Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights regulates freedom of expression. Article 10.1 stipulates that everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. This article shall not prevent states from requiring the licensing of broadcasting, television, or cinema enterprises. Article 10.2 adds that the exercise of these freedoms, since it carries with it duties and responsibilities, may be subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions, or penalties as are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security, territorial integrity, or public safety, for the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, for the protection of the reputation or rights of others, for preventing the disclosure of information received in confidence, or for maintaining the authority and impartiality of the judiciary. Turkey is also signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966. Article 19 of this covenant entitles everyone has the freedom of expression, including the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds. And the Constitution of the Republic of Turkey, besides, guarantees freedom of thought and opinion, Article 25, freedom of expression and dissemination of thoughts and opinions, Article 26, press freedom and inadmissibility of censorship, Article 28, and unacceptability of confiscation of printing houses and their annexes on grounds of having been used in a crime, Article 30. The jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights is clear that press freedom and freedom of expression are of fundamental importance for a fully functioning democratic society. In line with Article 10.2, journalists carry evidently responsibilities. They must fulfill their journalistic duty, taking into account some legal restrictions, such as the protection of underages, their ethical codes, and the good practices of their profession. But as an integral part of a functioning democracy, they also enjoy, therefore, a greater protection. For instance, they have the right not to disclose their sources of information. The European Court of Human Rights expressed it in the Handicide against UK arrest on 7 December 1976, which reads, I quote, "Freedom of expression is one of the basic conditions for its progress and for the development of every man. Subject to paragraph 2 of Article 10, it is application not only to information or ideas that are favorably received or regarded as inoffensive or as a matter of indifference, but also to those that offend, shock, or disturb the state or any sector of the population." Richard Handicide had, as a publisher, published a book, The Little Red Book, that was considered by that as obscene by the British government. The European Court of Human Rights rarely accepts national decisions that limit press freedom and freedom of expression, because political discussions must be widespread in a functioning democracy. It appears clearly in the Castells judgment back on 26 March 1992, and this case has clear implications for the current state of freedom of press and expression in Turkey. Mr. Castells was a Basque lawyer and a senator for Herri Batasuna, a political movement in favor of Basque independence. He had written an article in a newspaper stating that a lot of Basque killings remain unsolved, and stated that everyone knew that extreme right-wing paramilitary groups were responsible for those killings. He added that the fact there were no judicial prosecutions was not only the responsibility of the government, but it was also impossible to think that these paramilitary groups could have acted without the knowledge and support of the government, and he was subsequently convicted for insulting state institutions. The Spanish government stressed that freedom of expression was not absolute, but carried with its duties and responsibilities. Mr. Castells, it added, had insulted a democratic government in order to destabilize it in a very sensitive, indeed critical period for Spain, namely shortly after the adoption of the democratic constitution. But the European Court of Human Rights didn't accept this argumentation. I quote, "The limits of permissible criticism are wider with regard to the government than in relation to a private citizen or even a politician. In a democratic system, the actions or omissions of the government must be subject to the close scrutiny not only of the legislative and judicial authorities, but also of the press and public opinion." In a more recent arrest, Mehmet Hasan Altan versus Turkey on 20 March 2018, the European Court of Human Rights stated again that it was, I quote, "prepared to take into account the circumstances surrounding the cases brought before it, in particular the difficulties facing Turkey in the aftermath of the attempted military coup. However, the court considers that one of the principal characteristics of democracy is the possibility it offers of resolving problems through public debate. In the court's view, even in a state of emergency, which is, as the Constitutional Court noted, a legal regime whose aim is to restore the normal regime by guaranteeing fundamental rights, the contracting states must bear in mind that any measures taken should seek to protect the democratic order from the threats to it, and every effort must be made to safeguard the values of a democratic society, such as pluralism, tolerance, and broad-mindedness. Since 2000, the European Court has been seized of 164 cases relating to freedom of expression and involving Turkish journalists and or media. And it condemned Turkey in 154 of these cases, which is in 93.90% of the cases. In the early 2000s, 7 cases were struck off of the list following compensatory agreements between the Turkish state and the complainants. But this practice subsequently disappeared, and it can be observed that the years 2005, 2006, 2007, 2010, and 2014 register particularly higher number of cases being decided upon in Strasbourg. According to data from the European Court of Human Rights regarding its legal work in 2018, Turkey breached Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights regarding the protection of freedom of expression in 40 court cases. As it stands, Turkey has been delivered the highest numbers of sentences in trials concerning freedom of expression cases at the European Court of Human Rights. Many of the cases that came in front of the court relate to the legal framework restriction or deliberate misinterpretation of the Turkish Penal Code and the Prevention of Terrorism Act. After Mr. Erdogan came to power back in 2004, there were limited improvements in human rights protection in Turkey, but problems regarding the press freedom have never been addressed seriously. The Turkish state's policy of denial of ethnic or linguistic minorities threatened mostly Kurdish or Armenian journalists. An emblematic case that illustrates this repression is the case of Hrant of Firat Dink, a Turkish Armenian journalist and writer. Between 7 November 2003 and 17 November 2004, he wrote 8 articles devoted to the identity of Turkish citizens of Armenian origin. And in his articles, he stated the identity of the Armenians was too heavily built on the desire to see the Armenian genocide recognized by the Turks. At a certain moment, the prefect of Istanbul informed Dink that if he continued to publish articles of this kind, he could not guarantee his security. Dink was prosecuted and finally condemned to 6-month detention in 2006 and was later murdered by a young Turkish nationalist in Istanbul on 19 January 2007 in front of the offices of his bilingual weekly newspaper, Agos. He had been awarded the 2006 Oxfam Novy Pen Prize for Freedom of Expression. On 25 July 2011, Ögün Samast, his killer, was sentenced to 22 years imprisonment for premeditated murder and illegal possession of a firearm by the Istanbul Children's Criminal Court. Initially, his lawyers stated that the police forces were informed about the plan to kill Dink and even were helping to organize it. The prosecution against a large number of police officers, however, did not lead to any indictment or conviction. The European Court of Human Rights condemned Turkey for not guaranteeing the security and the life of Hrant Dink. But gradually, the repression extended to left-wing journalists, extreme left-wing journalists, nationalists or so-called Kemalist journalists and investigative journalists. And an important event in this evolution was the Ergenekon case. Ergenekon was the name of an alleged criminal network that was said to associate with high-ranking officers of the army and the gendarmerie, extreme right-wing and national left-wing activists, mafia groups, academics, and journalists that were allegedly preparing to overthrow the government. Between June 2007 and November 2009, some 300 people, including journalists, were arrested and 194 prosecuted in various capacities in this context. In his opening speech delivered on 10 January 2011 in anticipation of the International Law Congress 2012 organized by the Ankara Bar Association, Metin Feyzioglu, the president of the Ankara Bar Association, stated, I quote, "We no longer have freedom of press in Turkey. Tens of journalists who expressed their thoughts were taken under custody in open-ended inquiries. The newspapers, televisions, radios are forced to implement self-censor. Implementations of tax audits, penal inquiries, and civilian authorities put pressure on the press and media. Local press and media whose screams are not heard in Ankara or Istanbul is left to the following predicament: obey or perish. In fact, there is no freedom of expression in a country where there is no freedom of press." End of quote. Nedim Sener and Ahmet Sik, two investigative journalists of a high level, very critical towards the government, were criticizing the Ergenekon case as an attempt at the leading party, with the help of members of the Gülen movement in the judiciary, to shut down the opposition against the government. Both were arrested on 3 March 2011 and spent over a year in prison when they were released on 12 March 2012. Worse still, the investigation never reached the trial stage. And if you allow me, when I visited myself Istanbul in 2011 to witness a court case involving journalists, even the taxi driver who brought me back to the Atatürk airport told me he was shocked by the detention of Ahmet Sik and Nedim Sener. Barış Terkoglu and Barış Pelivan, working for the Oda TV website, were released on 14 September 2012 after 578 days in detention. Their trial in the Ergenekon case for revealing that the prosecutor in charge of the case had had lunch with the president of the court never reached its conclusion. Others suffered a less favorable fate. On 2 November 2013, Turkish-Dutch journalist writer Füsun Erdogan and journalists Bahraim Namaz, Sedat Senoglu, Ibrahim Çiçek, Ziya Ulusoy, and Arif Çelebi were sentenced to life imprisonment for membership to a terrorist organization. The founder of Özgür Radio, Füsun Erdogan, was arrested on September 12, 2006 and prosecuted on 296 charges, including that of being a member of an illegal organization, the Marxist-Leninist Communist Party of Turkey. Released from prison pending her appeal trial after nearly 8 years in prison, Füsun Erdogan found refuge in the Netherlands. In 2010, the European Journalists Federation held its general meeting in Istanbul, on the invitation of her Turkish member unions, because that year 44 journalists were detained in Turkey. The following year, in 2011, more than 100 journalists were detained, and by the end of 2012, Turkey held 80 journalists in jail, and this number fluctuated in the following years. On 10 October 2012, in its report to the European Parliament and Council on Turkey's admission for membership to the European Union, the European Commission wrote, I quote, "The increasing incidence of violations of freedom of expression raised serious concerns, and freedom of the media continued to be further restricted in practice. The increasing tendency to imprison journalists, media workers, and distributors fueled these concerns. High-level government and state officials and the military repeatedly turned publicly against the press and launched court cases. On a number of occasions, journalists have been fired after signing articles openly critical of the government. All of this, combined with the high concentration of the media in industrial conglomerates with interest going far beyond the free circulation of information and ideas, has a chilling effect and limits freedom of expression in practice, while making self-censorship a common phenomenon in the Turkish media." The attempt coup on the 9 from 15 to 16 July 2016 and the declaration of a state of emergency on 20 July 2016 gave rise to a campaign of increased repression for which journalists and the media were largely victims, among others, including lawyers, trade unionists, academics, magistrates, etc. To be recalled, Mustafa Kambas, a photojournalist for the Turkish daily Yeni Safak, was killed during the attempted coup. In the early hours of Saturday, 16 July, Turkish soldiers who attempted to overthrow the government seized control of several newsrooms, including the Ankara studios of the state broadcaster TRT, Turkish Radio and Television. They forced news anchor Tijen Karash to read a televised statement at gunpoint. Tijen Karash and the members of the newsroom were held hostages for hours and were threatened. Soldiers also took over Istanbul offices of Dogan Media Center, which houses several media outlets, including Hürriyet daily newspaper, the English language Hürriyet Daily News, and the private television stations CNN Türk and Kanal D, holding several journalists and other staff in the building hostages for part of the night, while several journalists were attacked during the clashes. In Istanbul, Selçuk Samiloglu, a photojournalist for Hürriyet Associated Press, was attacked and assaulted by civilians protesting against the coup. In the following days, weeks, and months, in addition to the traditional targets, so-called Gülenist journalists and media outlets were targeted. The Gülen movement, named after its exiled leader, the Turkish scholar Fethullah Gülen, is accused by the Turkish authorities of organizing the 15 July attempted coup and of having infiltrated the entire Turkish state apparatus. It is what Nedim Sener and Ahmet Sik had written 5 years earlier, and the reason why they had been detained. And Ahmet Sik was nevertheless detained again on 29 December 2016 and held in solitary confinement in Metris prison until 2 January 2017. He was only released on appeal on 9 March 2018. One possible motive for its detention is the investigation work he had produced in between on corruption cases involving AKP members, the ruling party's members. By the end of 2016, 178 media outlets, including news agencies, newspapers, and television channels, were closed by executive decrees. A further 30 publishers were closed down and their books banned. The total number of books banned through those closures reached the thousands, and people apprehended while in acquisition of books, magazines, and newspapers faced prison sentences. State of emergencies declared decrees closed 19 labor unions, one of which was Ufuk Habersen, one of the largest media workers' union, and membership to Ufuk Habersen was recognized by the Supreme Court of Appeals as evidence of collaboration with a terror organization. According to Reporters Without Borders, the numbers of journalists detained only in the first year of the state of emergency surpassed 100. Other organizations gave much larger figures, with Free Journalists Initiative claiming that 187 journalists were under arrest by the end of July 2018. Those discrepancies among numbers given by different organizations underlined a more dangerous trend of churn in Turkish jails and lack of information about the fate of journalists in the country. By the time this report was prepared, the Free Journalist Initiative's number was 154, and for RSS, Reporter Without Borders, 34. A further 167 journalists were under search warrant and had to flee Turkey to escape arrest, according to the Stockholm Center for Freedom database. On 10 and 11 March 2017, the Venice Commission, which has a tradition of balanced and well-thought opinions, adopted an opinion on the measures provided in the recent emergency decree laws with respect to freedom of the media. And the Commission criticized the Turkish government's statement that these measures were necessary to fight against terrorism in the country. I quote, "Many official interlocutors whom the delegation of the Venice Commission met in Ankara argued that the measures taken by the authorities had nothing to do with freedom of expression because the action was taken in the fight against terrorism. To the great regret of the Venice Commission, such rhetoric reflects profound misapprehensions of the concept of free speech. The existence of any potential threat represented by the media outlets at issue should be demonstrated with reference to some specific facts, for example, be inferred from the content of the specific previous publication of the media outlet concerned. The Venice Commission previously observed that mass dismissals of public servants, especially in the army and police, may be legitimate, accepting that public servants have a duty of loyalty toward the state. However, unlike public servants, the journalists, newspapers, TV stations, etc., have no such duty. Quite the contrary, one of the journalistic virtues is to keep a critical attitude towards the authorities and the politicians. Due to the role of the media as a public watchdog, they enjoy a higher level of protection than any other business. In addition, in assessing the impact of those measures, the authorities should also take into account a potential chilling effect these measures may have on the media market as a whole, and not only on the particular group of journalists or their readers. From 14 to 18 November 2016, the Special Rapporteur on the protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression conducted an official visit to Turkey at the invitation of the government. The visit took place just months after the attempt coup from July 2016. The report gives a clear overview of the attacks against the press freedom. I quote, "Media outlets subject to the emergency decrees are not limited to media allegedly affiliated to Gülen. The closure of Özgür Gündem and the book publisher Evrensel and police raid on Cumhuriyet are examples of how the state of emergency has been deployed against critical or independent media outlets and publishers." And the report concluded with a serious warning. The situation of the right to freedom of expression in Turkey is in grave crisis and requires immediate steps for Turkey to be compliant with its obligations under international human rights law. From 11 to 13 September 2019, a joint international press mission composed of the International Press Institute, Article 19, the European Federation of Journalists, the Committee to Protect Journalists, PEN International, Norwegian PEN, Reporters Without Borders, and the European Center for Press and Media Freedom visited Turkey. And their mission concluded, Central to this crisis are the 100 plus journalists behind bars and the hundreds more facing prosecution on terrorism-related charges. While the names in jail have fluctuated over the past 3 years, the overall figures have barely declined since a high of over 160, making Turkey out as the undisputed leading jailer for journalists worldwide, a title it has held for almost a decade. Behind those figures lies a story of egregious violations of fundamental rights, with dozens of journalists held on the most serious terrorism-related charges for months, sometimes years, pending trial, in many cases without an official indictment. When their day in court eventually arrives, the prosecution's case invariably hangs on the flimsiest of evidence where legitimate critical journalism has been conflated with terrorist propaganda, part of a campaign to silence opposition voices and close down free speech. The platform to strengthen the protection of journalism and the safety of journalists was created by the Council of Europe on 2 April 2015. This platform includes the international and the European Federation of Journalists, the European Association of Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, Article 19, the International News Safety Institute, the Committee to Protect Journalists, Index on Censorship, the International Press Institute, the Rory Peck Trust, the European Broadcasting Union, PEN International, the European Center for Press and Media Freedom, Free Press Unlimited, and the Open Society Institute. In its annual report 2020, the platform called on the Turkish authorities to stop treating critical journalism as a criminal activity. I quote, "As of 30 December 2019, there were 103 active alerts and 24 resolved alerts on Turkey. These include 91 journalists in detention and 4 impunity cases. 18 new alerts were submitted in 2019. Turkey has not responded to any of the 2019 alerts. The 2019 alerts included incidents of violent attacks on journalists, the expulsions of 4 foreign correspondents, arbitrary arrests during attempts to report on demonstrations in southeastern Turkey, and criminal investigations for criticism of Turkey's incursion into northern Syria. On March 10, 2019, long-term German correspondents Jörg Brase and Thomas Seibert had to leave after the authorities refused to renew their press credentials. Vaguely worded anti-terror laws were also used against foreign journalists and dual nationals. In September 2018, the authorities detained Austrian journalist Max Zirngast at his home in Ankara and charged him with being a member of an unknown leftist terrorist organization based on his writing. He spent 3.5 months in pre-trial detention before being released from jail with a travel ban imposed until the conclusion of the trial. He was eventually acquitted of all charges in September 2019. German-Turkish journalist Deniz Yücel was held for over a year on espionage charges before being released in February 2018. A dozen of foreign journalists were expelled from Turkey following the breakdown of a fragile peace process between the PKK and the Turkish state forces in July 2015. French journalist Olivier Bertrand was deported in November 2016 after being arrested while reporting the Gaziantep province, Italian journalist Gabriele Del Garande was arrested in April 2017 near the Syrian border and deported 3 weeks later. French journalist Mathias Depardon was arrested in May 2017 while taking pictures in Batman province and deported the following month. 2019 saw a significant effort by the Turkish government to convince international partners that is engaging in serious reform of the judicial system. Some elements of a judicial reform package have brought relief to some journalists, in particular the lifting of a ban on journalists sentenced to less than 5 years from appealing to the Supreme Court, a change that has led to the release of a number of defendants pending appeal. However, the package largely fails to address the most significant demands made of Turkey by institutions such as the Venice Commission, including ensuring that journalists are not subject to anti-terror charges based on their writing, and the authorities demonstrate relevant and sufficient reasons for the detention of journalists. Meanwhile, the powers of the Radio and Television High Council, RTUK, have been extended to online broadcasters, which are now required to apply for expensive licenses. The lack of clarity on what is deemed an online broadcaster means that RTUK could potentially begin to police critical social media, the platform of the Council of Europe further commented. The mission report of the Joint International Press Freedom Mission to Turkey also devoted an entire section on the regulation of online broadcaster by the Radio and Television High Council, which provides further limitation of digital media, and commented, "A primary concern of the process is that one of the conditions for license is to pass a security check by the National Intelligence Organization and the police, a requirement that is clearly open to misuse." A new bill was approved by the Turkish Parliament on 29 July 2020 on media platforms. This new regulation compels social media companies with over 1 million users a day to have representatives based in Turkey who are Turkish nationals. In case of non-compliance, they might impose fines up to 40 million Turkish lira, approximately 5 million euros, advertising bans, and a reduction of internet bandwidth by up to 90%, effectively blocking access to their platform. Tech companies are forced to store their data locally. This means that it will be easier for the Turkish government to demand that companies hand over data about their customers that could well lead to their prosecution for what they have said or even shared online. Platforms are also obliged to respond to requests to block or remove content within 48 hours or face fines of 5 million Turkish lira, which could increase to 10 million Turkish lira if they fail to respond.
Mr. Leruth, may I just ask you to go to your conclusion?
I conclude.
Because time is flying.
Yes, so I came to the conclusion. The first question was, can Turkey at this stage be considered as a country within which a sufficient degree of freedom of the press and freedom of expression is guaranteed so it can be in compliance with the standards of functioning democracy? And to answer this question, I will consider following elements. Turkey has been condemned for violation of Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights 154 times since 2000. This is a significant number of times. The report shows many prosecutions and severe convictions for insult or defamation of the President of the State. The mission report of the Joint International Press Freedom Mission mentioned 12,300 cases from 2014 till 2017. The number of journalists kept in pre-trial or convicted for long-term imprisonment, making Turkey one of the undisputed leading jailers of journalists worldwide, is again clearly not in accordance with human rights guarantees. Closing down around 200 media outlets, having blocked more than 400,000 websites and organizing a strict system of authorization for classical radio and for online broadcasters, again, is in clear contradiction with human rights, in particular Article 10. And against this background, it can be concluded that Turkey cannot currently be considered as a country within which a sufficient degree of freedom of the press and freedom of expression is guaranteed. Turkey is not acting in compliance with the standard of a functioning democracy, because a functioning democracy without an effective guaranteed freedom of press is impossible. Second question, can the decisions taken by the Turkish government still be considered as a reaction linked to the coup, or need they to be evaluated as a way to destroy the voices and or organization critical of the government in Turkey? The failed coup and the fight against terrorism have been the main justification of the part of the Turkish government and the different international rapporteurs and before the European Court of Human Rights. But this justification cannot serve valid grounds for all the violations committed by the Turkish governments. First, the examples given in the report show that the repression did not start after the failed coup. The procedures against Dink and the procedures against Cumhuriyet, just to name those two, started ways before. Also, the timing and targeting of a long list of journalists in the following days shows that these journalists had been on the Turkish government's list well before the failed coup. The failed coup was therefore an excellent opportunity to execute this long-established plan. As the Venice Commission stated, if the government's intention was to react against a threat of terrorism or to avoid a new coup to occur, then other methods should have been used. Taking into account all these elements, the ultimate yet unfortunate conclusion of the report is that the violations of press freedom committed by the Turkish government can no longer be considered a reaction linked to the coup or aiming at fighting political violence and terrorism. The clear purpose is to silence all critical voices in Turkey as much as possible, whereby prosecution and long-term imprisonment are used as frequent method to reach that goal. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Leruth. It's true that freedom of expression is the basis of democracy. It's a condition of democracy. And the European Court of Human Rights repeat that time and again. I think it's important to go back to the basic. So now the floor is open to the judges to put some questions. I will start with you, Judge Bayens.
Thank you, Madam President, and many thanks for this excellent report. You describe in your report a wide variety of measures that directly or indirectly are affecting or seem to be affecting freedom of the press in Turkey. And it definitely stands out the use of criminal law, now the criminalization and judicial harassment against journalists and media workers. But have you also, in your research and in your work for over these years on Turkey, found significant cases of violence against journalists? That's an aspect that is mentioned. You mentioned some examples, but could you give us a sense of, how much of a problem is actual violence against journalists? That would be one question, and then maybe we can go to the other question. Thank you.
Thank you. As a matter of fact, the only facts of direct violence we could witness was during the attempt coup, because the population in Turkey generally, well, when I mean Turkey, I never went into rural Turkey, but I can say in Istanbul, Ankara, also in the Kurdish region, the population generally supports journalists. And when I mentioned the taxi driver who brought me after Nedim Sener and Ahmed Sheikh were detained, was for me significant. It was just enough that I said I was a journalist that immediately he told me spontaneously about this. The main problems the Turkish journalists face is the hostility of the state authorities through repression and especially since the attempt coup.
Can I? Yes, I do have. I have two more, if I may. The second one is, as a journalist, and again, based on your research on the situation in Turkey, and also your conclusion that the current state of affairs in Turkey is not compliant with its international obligations. But can you elaborate on what you think is the impact on society of these, and what the level of self-censorship currently amongst journalists is, and what the impact in society you can see?
As I said, not only journalists were targeted after the attempted coup. Trade unionists, academics, magistrates, lawyers were imprisoned and subject to different judicial actions. I remember attending a meeting in Brussels by a magistrate who wanted to react, and we thought it was useful to join forces to try to get a positive result, but eventually we couldn't. Very generally, I would say, when you have a colleague who is arrested because he wrote about a topic, you must be very courageous to take over the same topic and develop it. And I must say, in Turkey, I know many courageous journalists, some journalists who were detained and came out of prison with a case still open, which means with a sword of Damocles above their heads. They resume their activity and further are very critical of the authorities. But as the president of the Ankara Bar Association said, we know the situation of well-known journalists in Istanbul or Ankara, of the well-known media, but local media whose screams are not heard, as he said, in Ankara or Istanbul, may indeed obey or perish.
Thank you. And the final question is, you mentioned in your report this term or concept that has been developed under the emergency decrees, the iltisak, coherence as a form of terrorist activity. You have it on on your report when you're talking about some of the findings of the joint mission, international press freedom mission to Turkey. Could you elaborate or explain a little bit more about that and how it's being used against journalists and media workers?
Could you be a bit more precise?
You make reference in your report, and it's okay. We can also, it's in your written report. But I found very interesting and concerning the use of these. It says Turkey invented iltisak, and in parentheses coherence, as a form of terrorist activity. Accordingly, coherence, like moving as conjoined to one another, voluntary submitting, facing same direction, interpreting circumstances from the same viewpoint, etc. I mean, it's a long description, falls into that definition. But what it was not very clear to me is how it was being applied to the press.
As a matter of fact, this kind of reasoning is repeatedly used but I would say in some dossiers, and for instance, more generally, it's a phenomenon that's not only Turkish. We call it criminalization of journalistic activities. We would take what a journalist writes or says, we take a piece of this, and we can derive from this that he or she is in favor of a terrorist movement or is a member of a terrorist organization and so on.
Judge van der Westhuizen, yeah, we have the floor.
Small question about a small part of your report, paragraph 12 or section 12 on page 265, insult of the president and of the state. I see that the penal code criminalizes insulting the president and the state. In these days of elections, yesterday in Canada, soon in Germany, we heard presidential candidate Biden calling President Trump a clown, perhaps justifiably. And then you mentioned that 12,300 cases, or actually you take it from the Joint International Press Freedom Mission report. What kind of examples do we have? What may one not say about the president, and for that matter also the state, with 12,300 cases filed under Articles 299 and 301 of the Penal Code? Do you have any examples?
I unfortunately don't read the Turkish press, but it's also a comparison what happens in other democracy. In our democracy, I mean, take France, for instance, or our countries, or United Kingdom. You mentioned the United States or Canada. You cannot imagine a head of state or head of government suing a journalist for insult or defamation unless you accuse him of wrongdoings and so. But if you criticize his action or her action very sharply, you will never get such a process. It doesn't make part of the penal code.
I understand.
You know? And in Turkey, this is still a penal offense, which is the difference. I could, I'm not a journalist anymore, but I could always be sued for defamation on civil and ask for civil right, but not from a politician. That's not thinkable.
I understand the private law. I understand that it can be defamation if I say the president has a certain sickness or whatever. But if I say the president is an idiot on economic issues, or something like that, which would very often be a valid comment in many countries. Okay, I'm just wondering when is somebody charged with this offense? If you say the president is ugly, the president is stupid, the president should not be president, I think I will be a better president. And how does one insult the state? The state, you say Turkey is a police state, or when is it an insult?
No. But the fact is that this high number of cases mentioned in the report was astonishing, because never, in no place, you would say the prime minister is an idiot or doesn't know anything in economics. You will never be sued as a journalist for this. Maybe the prime minister won't talk to you anymore. I could understand. But in Turkey, there were indeed penal prosecutions. That's not compliant with Article 10, once again.
It's your turn.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. You told us that some foreign journalists have been arrested and detained in Turkish jails. You mentioned the case of an Austrian and an Italian journalist. My question is the following. Have these detentions and arrests have created a reaction by the respective states of these journalists, the states to whom they belong, at the diplomatic level against Turkey? And if yes, what impact have this reaction had on your Turkish authorities?
I couldn't say if all states protested. I know that Germany protested. I think the two mentioned journalists could return to Turkey afterwards, indeed. And there was indeed a protest by not only the journalist associations and so, but and anyhow, I know at least in Germany, but I'm thinking in France and Italy there was also they expressed their discontent about this, because once again, you know, when you work as a journalist in a foreign country, you have to receive a press accreditation, but normally it's it's going automatically. If you are a professional journalist, you receive the accreditation. So the very fact they received it, they were deprived of it, was already an offensive act, and expulsion, of course, more clearly. And indeed, there were reactions.
So I suppose exactly the same answer, because Judge Bianco has exactly the same question. So the same answer, okay?
Yeah.
If you agree. Okay. Thank you very much. I think no other question. Thank you very much. Thank you.